G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined this week's episode of the Pub Test, and in this video, we are looking at the victims of Jack the Ripper. Not just the 5 main ones, but the ones that have been mentioned as to maybe connected with this case. Now, why? Well, we've looked at quite a few suspects and we try to fit them around the crimes with some of them. But by looking at the victims, what happened when they were found, what were their lives like, who were these people? Because we are talking about real people. When I say that though, maybe not all of them were real. Because like some of the suspects, some of these victims may not have existed either. Because why we're doing so is because it gives us a snapshot of what life was like. And also gets us an understanding of what the general population were feeling. And maybe the trepidation that they had with these different crimes happening in the city in only the span of like 2-3 years, maybe a little bit more. And by doing so, we perhaps will get a better feel for the whole case in general. It might open our eyes to seeing, well, perhaps a few of the suspects we've discussed may rise up the list a little. Or perhaps it might help us when we look at some of the suspects we haven't covered yet to see if they perhaps could have committed these crimes. So the first one occurred on December the 26th, 1887. So Boxing Day, 1887. And it was Fairy Fay. Now, very little is known about Fairy Fay. So a historian and a writer as well, and you can still find his books out there, but in around 1950, Terence Robertson mentioned Fairy Fay. Now, he did say, look, I don't know the exact name, but this is the one he was running with. And it described her demise, and it was rather terrible that she had something in her abdomen. And it was a brutal way of being killed. But then another writer in about 1970 or so, or a bit later, I'm not 100% sure, but his name was Cullen, and then he also listed in his book that Fairy Fay was the first Ripper victim, but he had some more detail and showing that her body had been mutilated very similar to the actual 5 known victims of Jack the Ripper. But we have a little bit of a problem. Firstly, and admittedly, the first person who mentioned Fairy Fay said, look, I don't know the exact name. So only 3 people were found that had a similar name that you probably could match, who died around that time, but none of them had been murdered. Another issue was the police had no record of anyone being murdered there on Boxing Day on 1887. Now, Robinson said that Fairy Fay was walking back from the Mitre Square pub and taking a shortcut home, but no such pub actually existed. And what's also of note is that the newspapers made no mention of any crime like this that had happened. Did she even exist? It would appear highly, highly unlikely with all of that evidence. So how did she crop up into the Jack the Ripper sphere? Well, it would be suggested that perhaps the first person, Robertson, sort of made it up a little bit to sensationalize his little story that he had going, and it is suggested that he did this with quite a few of his books. Took some facts and embellished it to make a more interesting story. And what is of note, and we will get on to this person shortly, but the way she was killed is very similar to another person we'll mention in this video, Emma Smith. And that is a very sobering but also interesting point to this Jack the Ripper saga. Yet, in defense of Cullen, who put Fairy Fay into his book. It's possible that he'd read Robinson's book, and because it was well before the internet and you couldn't overly check these things, he may have believed it to be true, but also added some detail as well for a bit of sensationalism, maybe just to prove the point a little bit further about the mutilations. Yet, there is another interesting note to make, which actually it's important to discuss because it actually helps us to understand what was life like in Whitechapel at the time. Some have said actually that it wasn't Fairy Fay who was the person, it was Toddy Fay. And she was quite well known in the Whitechapel area. In Australia, we would refer to her as a bit of a larrikin. And there's many newspaper reports about Toddy Fay if you want to have a look at them. But basically, she wasn't a dangerous person. Just by reports at times, she didn't wear the appropriate amount of clothing when she was out in the street. She used to use some rather colourful language of an inappropriate nature at times as well. On one time she got arrested, she had a crowd gathered around her for reasons that aren't fully stated in the paper, but we can sort of guess that she was making a bit of a spectacle of herself. And in that particular arrest, she gave 3 different ages. First she said I'm 18, then she said she was 40, then she said she was 28. And she also gave a couple of different names as she was being arrested. And then the newspaper listed the fact that she ran with about 20 to 30 different aliases. So she was very well known to police. She was actually very well known to the general public as well. Today, we probably all may know someone like that you just think, look, they'd be a great person if they could just pull themselves together a little bit. And definitely Toddy Fay would have matched that description. But the police eventually could not do much with her, so finally she's before a judge. So she's now deemed as to be insane, and she's put in one of those asylums to help her with her mental health. And that's basically the last we really know of this person, Toddy Fay. Yes, not Fairy Fay. She wasn't murdered. But people have tried to make that connection that perhaps this person was referring to her. I don't really think so, but getting back onto Fairy Fay, people have written horrific songs about her. There's even a doll out there based around this myth of a Fairy Fay. But what I do think is interesting, because of this myth of Fairy Fay, we actually got to know a little bit about Toddy. And then that actually opens our eyes to what was happening in Whitechapel. So we see that the police were just busy with their general duties. They had other people to deal with. It wasn't just a sole focus on Jack the Ripper. But like some of the suspects, yeah, people also made up some of the things to do with the victims to sensationalize it and to sell their books or whatever they were trying to do. But interestingly, back then, the newspapers yet hadn't got their hands on this story, because this is a more modern day fabrication. But our next victim is definitely real. So our second person on this list is a woman by the name of Annie Millwood. And like many back then, we don't have a huge amount of detail about her life. We do know she was roughly in her late 30s, maybe 38, 39. It's said that her husband had passed away, so she was now a widow, and her husband had served in the military. Other suggestions say perhaps she was an unfortunate, as the term for the women of the night was given, but that actually is not definite at all. There's no official proof of that. But regardless, on her way home on February 25th, 1888, in the Whitechapel area, she gets attacked. And she gets multiple stab wounds in her legs and lower torso. But she makes it to the infirmary. And it's said after about a month, she makes a full recovery from this attack. Now, she says, I got to look at the bloke, but I didn't recognise him at all. So it was just a total random stranger attacking her. Now, you would think that this would create a huge blow-up in the paper, that here is this poor woman walking home where she should feel safe, and now she's been attacked with a knife. So how did the press report this particular event? Well, they say that this lady was attacked, but no one actually saw it happen. But it's undeniable that she was stabbed. Are you serious? That was the reporting of this woman being violently attacked by some random nutter. Now, if you have been watching this series or are familiar with many of the Jack the Ripper suspects, this attack was almost a copycat of what Thomas Cutbush was arrested and put into an asylum for. And yet someone else was also performing similar types of attacks in that area as well, who also got caught. And yes, they were probably imitating the London monster who terrorised London 100 years prior. But the fact that they were dismissive of this poor woman, Annie, is mind-bogglingly unbelievable, considering how they would change their tune only a few months later when Ripper hysteria took over. But now, how does she fit in to the Ripper crimes? Why would people suggest that this one was a Jack the Ripper attack? Well, as we mentioned, Thomas Cutbush was on that list. And so he did some crimes similar, and people suggest, the Sun newspaper in 1894 suggested that he was Jack the Ripper. So was this one of his crimes, and therefore was this a Ripper crime? There's another suggestion, and this is actually my thought on it. I don't think I've seen this written anywhere, but it could have been a type of a trial run. And what do I mean? Well, if you were this really smart person who was going to start performing these crimes and not be detected, what would you do? Well, maybe you'd go and attack someone. And remember, Annie was not subdued, so no doubt she was screaming. If you're being attacked like that, you are screaming for your life. And of course, everyone came to her rescue, didn't they? Well, no, nobody came. No one saw it. And you might think, well, how? Why would that happen? But when we read about many events back then, people heard some of the official Ripper victims being attacked. But they said, look, we just thought it was the neighbours having another argument or just some people on the street having a blue. So we might think that that is a bit odd. Yes, and I would understand if someone's screaming for their life and you knew that, you would be running to help out, no doubt. Or at least most people would. But if you weren't too sure, you just think, like it is just that regular commotion that you hear on the street, perhaps you don't have that same worry. And it is the same today. People haven't changed. You go to a shopping centre and a car alarm goes off. Do you see the crowds of people running to that car to catch the criminal who's breaking in? No. Most of us just go, well, it's not my car, that's fine, and you keep on going. Like, unless it's something out of the ordinary, we just don't seem to pay that much attention to things. And so perhaps Jack the Ripper was testing the waters. How much could he get away with without attracting attention? And then finding that out, well, that may have emboldened him to go on to commit these crimes. So that's my thought on how this could possibly fit in to the Jack the Ripper saga. So is that the end of the story of Annie Millwood? Well, unfortunately, no. Upon her release in March, I think it was March 21st, 1888, from the infirmary, she goes to the workhouse. So she's just been violently attacked. They say she made a full recovery, and now she's in the workhouse. And those conditions at the workhouse were dreadful. 10 days later, on March 31st, 1888, they found her collapsed. And she passed away. They did a coronial inquest, and it was deemed she died of natural causes. Nothing to do with the injuries that had happened previous, because she'd made a full recovery. I doubt that. I find that offensive almost, that this poor woman being viciously attacked, then sent to a workhouse under woeful conditions, and then dies, and they say, well, it wasn't this bludger who attacked her. Nah, she was just going to die anyway. And that was the reporting in the papers. We see a marked change in attitude towards attacks on women in a few months' time as we go through this series. But it is interesting that this was the attitude at the time. And definitely we can see that the fate of women and things that could happen to them just really weren't rating all that highly in most people's minds at the time. And yes, no one was ever arrested or charged with the crime against Annie Millwood. But who is the next person on the Ripper victim list? So the third person on our victims list is a young woman by the name of Ada Wilson. And the details that we know about her is that she was most likely early 20s, living at home with her parents and a couple of siblings according to census records. And she was listed in this particular, around this time, in 1888, as a seamstress. And that little detail is important as we go through this particular story. So Ada finds herself home alone on March 28, 1888. Now this is during the day. She opens the door and here's a bloke, nicely dressed, nice hat, and he says, "Give me your money." And she says, "Tell it while you're walking, buddy. You're not getting anything from here." He pulls out a knife and slashes at her throat twice, striking her. Now she screams. Old Bud then decides he better take off and he runs. He's booking it. Interestingly, this did get the attention of people. And the bloke almost got caught. But he managed to get away. Now, how this bloke got away, we really don't know. But some suggest he may have been the infamous spring-heeled Jack. Yes, and I've only learnt about this bloke recently, but he was a bit of a mythical sort of monster in the cupboard character 50 years prior. And that's actually an interesting story, which will be covered in this channel sometime down the track. But basically, the guy could jump like big walls and just get away from people. And so because this guy was never caught, it suggested perhaps he was the reincarnation of this spring-heeled Jack. And it's also been suggested in comments too that maybe Thomas Cutbush was spring-heeled Jack because he was able to jump the walls of Broadmoor pretty well much. But the good news to this story is that Ada Wilson made a full recovery. At least physically full recovery. How you cope emotionally after opening your door and getting attacked like that, I don't know. And there obviously wasn't much mental health to help people back then. But we do see that she was in meaningful employment according to the census records, if the census records are still talking about the same Ada Wilson, because really we don't know because those records are fairly sketchy. But yeah, she did not pass away from this attack. Now, how does that fit into the Jack the Ripper crimes? And why was she linked as a victim to Jack the Ripper? The reason why she's been linked is because the notion that Jack the Ripper did not like the women of the night. And that Ada at the time was listed as a seamstress, which apparently was a euphemism for an unfortunate, a woman having to sell herself to make money. The funny part, though, is you could work as a seamstress. Many people made a living doing that as a job. Now, naturally, if you were an unfortunate living in these lodging houses, you would not give that as your occupation. You'd have to come up with something else. Yet, Ada was living at home. She wasn't in a lodging house. It seems like all the family were in some type of employment. Now, they weren't necessarily wealthy, but it's unlikely to me that she was involved in that activity. Also, this appeared to be more like a robbery. So why would a random person turn up to a house when someone would be in that employment, knowing they were living pretty well much day to day just to pay for their room? It had to have been some reason why this person would turn up demanding money at that house. We don't know. We really don't. But I doubt it was to get her takings from the night before. That's just my opinion, though. And I'd be interested to know what you think, so put that down in comments. But I think the real reason why she made this list in most people's minds who try to connect Ada Wilson to the Jack the Ripper is because of the description that she gave of the bloke who attacked her. He was well dressed. He had the hat. And the images that we see, the artist's impression of who Jack the Ripper would have looked like, very much match Ada's description of the person that attacked her. So the question is then, did the press look back on this story and then formulate the idea of this well-dressed person attacking women? Because this also did not gain a huge amount of media attention, and probably because Ada wasn't killed. She survived, and it was just a few wounds that she suffered, which is dreadful enough. I'm not saying that that's any way good, but at least it wasn't as bad as other people are going to suffer as we go through this. So whilst this was a good result that Ada survived this attack, that is not the case for many who are left on this list. So who is the fourth person on the Jack the Ripper victim list? So the fourth person on this list is Emma Smith. And just as a warning, I don't go into graphic details about what happens to these people, but you will get the concept of this one, and it is very brutal. So if you can't really stomach that sort of thing, then just jump ahead. But Emma Smith was around 45, so mid-40s. She herself had claimed that she was a widow, but then she also claimed she'd just left her husband. Suggested that she had a couple of children at least, but they weren't really in contact or not wanting to help her out of her situation, because it would appear that for about 10 years she had been working as an unfortunate and living in lodging houses. And it's a bit of an anomaly, this one, because the differing reports we read about Emma are quite interesting, I suppose, because even though she was working as an unfortunate, and at the time, those types of people were not held in high regard at all, it seemed that she had a little bit of a standing. People respected her. And yet, on the other side to that coin, we see that as part of the job, obviously, you'd go out and drink, and if she got some drinks into her, she could get rather feisty, and it was not uncommon for her to get involved in a couple of brawls here and there. But it was on April the 3rd, 1888, so this is less than a week after the attack on Ada Wilson at her house. So we're only around that time, but Emma Smith, as per usual, heads out to work for the night, leaving home round about 6 p.m. Obviously, you're having drinks to try and find your clients because that's where your clients are going to be. And then normally she would come home very late into the night and obviously pay for the room, and that would be her life. This night did not work out that way. On the way home, she gets attacked by at least 3 people, maybe 4. So these 3 or 4 people attacked her in a very personal way, and then on top of that took an item and put it into her abdomen, which no doubt would have caused excruciating pain. But they left her there to die, and she was bleeding badly. It said that she took her scarf and tried to stem the bleeding and got back to her lodging house, where a friend of hers noticed her situation and said, "You've got to go to the hospital." And it said that she was reluctant to go, but they took her anyway. The surgeon who was on duty noticed the injuries to her and realized it was not going to be a good outcome. But the police come and get a report, and she is dropping in and out of consciousness, but she manages to give the description of what happened. So at least 3 people attacked her, and it was possibly 4. Upon completion of giving the report to the police, she dropped into a coma, and then 4 days later passes away. So how does this one make the Jack the Ripper list? How have people made that possible connection? Well, on this channel we have talked about the High Rip Gang as the possible perpetrators of the Jack the Ripper crimes. Now, the way these crimes were done definitely fit the High Rip Gang, no doubt whatsoever. Because they were just these vicious bludgers, but they were from Liverpool. Now, did they come down to Whitechapel area? Well, it has been suggested that they did. But there's also another gang theory that we haven't covered yet, which actually is written down in some police reports. So that is also interesting. But it's possible, though, that this was just a group of low-life, bludgeoning individuals as well. Maybe not an organised gang. But for us to tie this into the Jack the Ripper crimes, we would have to accept that it wasn't just a single solitary person performing the crimes, because she clearly stated it was at least 3 people who attacked her. So many people discount Emma Smith as being on the Ripper list. But what is interesting, and part of this series is highlighting the reporting and the attitudes of people. This made a little bit of press, but it became more well known later when Ripper hysteria starts taking over. And people start looking back at some of these crimes saying, well, maybe this was the start of the Jack the Ripper saga. But I just have to say here at this part of the video, and it is a bit of a rant, the saddest part to this whole thing is we only know the Emma Smith story because of a possible connection to Jack the Ripper. Her attack was absolutely diabolical. But the thing is, these attacks still happen today, and many of them hardly make any news either. So we've got these sick, disgusting, cowardly, low-life individuals perpetrating the most despicable crimes still today. And so the story of Emma Smith, I think, needs to be told, not just from her point of view, but for all the victims of such atrocities who may never, ever get a mention and who may never get remembered. Now that I've got that off my chest, it's time that we move forward to the 5th person on this list. And this one, many people believe should be an official Jack the Ripper victim. So the fifth victim on this list, and many claim should be an actual official Ripper victim, is Martha Tabram. Now, she was born Martha White in May of 1849, and I do find it funny that she is actually known by that last name Tabram, because that was only a very small part of her life, really. She was the youngest of a few siblings, but it was in 1869 that she married Henry Tabram. Now, they had 2 children together, 2 boys, but then by 1875, they are no longer together. Now, so the story goes is that Henry said to her, "You've got a choice to make here. Do you want to be part of the family, or do you just want to keep drinking? Because drinking is ruining your life." Well, she chose the drinking. And so he moves her out of the house. But he doesn't totally cut her off. So he still pays a certain amount of money to her weekly so she's not homeless. But then it's said that she would accost him on the street and say, "Look, give me more money, give me more money." So he says, "Well, you know what, I will, but I'm going to now drop the amount of money I'm giving you per week because every time you see me, you're getting more money out of me." But then he finds out she started a relationship with a bloke by the name of Henry Turner, who was a carpenter. He wasn't very affluent, but he was an honest bloke. And him and Martha were then together on and off for the rest of her life. Mostly on, we would say. But then Henry Tabram cuts off any financial support to Martha. And oddly enough, she was more known as Martha Turner after this, because she was with Henry Turner for a lot longer than she was ever with the other Henry. But regardless, on the death certificate it says Tabram, and hence that's the name that has stuck when it comes to talking about her. Yet even Henry Turner would say that, look, her biggest problem was the drink. If she got any money, she was spending it on alcohol. So if you are going to the pub that often, just want to point this out, and you're handing your money across the counter, you are not buying shares in the business. It is not an investment strategy. You are donating to their cause, and they don't really care that much about what happens to you, really. So poor Martha, we can see, obviously had a major addiction issue. There was not much mental health help back in those days, and obviously with people being addicted to arsenic and alcohol and who knows what else, well, you were pretty much left to your own devices, and that didn't work out very well for some people, particularly ones like Martha. But it was on August 7th, and interestingly, it was around the bank holiday, and this was the same time that Emma Smith was murdered. Obviously a few months later, but it was around this bank holiday that Martha and another person, Pearlie Poll, go out to find some work, because by this stage Martha is now having to work the streets to survive. Now, it's reported that they met up with 2 soldiers at some point. They split up to carry on whatever activities was going to lead to some money changing hands, and that's the last Martha is seen of alive that anybody knows. Now, here it does get interesting, because it is said that Martha went to George Yard, which was really, really dimly lit, and that's where people would go if they were doing activities that they didn't want other people to see, but there were buildings there as well. Now, someone returned home to one of the buildings there in George Yard at about 10 to 2 in the morning, and when they walked past into this stairway, they didn't see anything. But it was around the same time, at 2 a.m. in the morning, that PC Barrett sees a military-looking bloke standing near this same building that this other person's just walked in and saw nothing, and said, what are you up to, buddy? He says, well, me mate just went off with a girl and he'll be back soon and then we'll be off. And so the policeman thinks really nothing more of it. Someone about an hour and a half later goes into this building in George Yard, sees what they think is a homeless person sleeping near the stairs. Now, they said that is not that uncommon, so they didn't think anything more of it. Now, understanding lighting is an issue and it was very dark, so you could forgive the person for thinking that. But it was about 4:45 in the morning, and remembering light is now coming into this building a little bit. So the person coming down the stairs then sees Martha, sees the blood, goes and gets a policeman. The policeman comes in, and then he doesn't disturb the body, it's said, but then the whole investigation happens. And yes, it was Martha Tabram, or Martha Turner, as she was more known back in the day. The injuries to her were absolutely dreadful. 39 odd stab wounds. It is said that probably 2 different knives were used, so she's had all sorts of injuries to major organs. As you know, I don't like going into gruesome detail, but I find this quite surprising because there's a few things to look at here. Firstly, there was a couple with the last name of Hewitt who basically where Martha's body was found, they would have been right beside it. There wasn't much way you could not have heard something, so they asked them. And first it's like, well, didn't hear a thing. This comes as a total shock. And then the wife says, but I did hear someone screaming out murder. But, that was down the street, and we hear that all the time. So I didn't really give much thought to it. We will get back to that, because there is something strange about that eyewitness account. Now, interestingly, they were not asked to go to the inquest. And I question that, and you'll see why as we go through this particular case. But you see, P.C. Barrett, that saw this soldier-looking person, he was then asked to come and try and identify the bloke that he saw, because it was known that Martha and Pearly Pole had gone off with 2 soldiers. So they try and find these 2 blokes. Unsuccessfully. Even at the lineup where P.C. Barrett is, he's said, oh, that was the guy there, and they've said to him, instead of picking him out, do you want to have another look? Because apparently the guy he picked out had a few medals, was a bit of a decorated soldier, so he picked out a different bloke, saying, oh yeah, no, now I'm clear it was him, and they worked out it wasn't him. Why that happened, I really don't know. But that's not the end of the mystery when it comes to Martha. Because at the inquest, they do say it was murder by person or persons unknown. And that's the way that case has remained since then. But the papers were linking Emma Smith's murder to Martha's, saying, look what happened. And when the next victim we talk about, they actually used all 3. They already had pinned Emma Smith, Martha, and our next victim all together, saying someone is committing these crimes. Now, oddly, or rather we could probably understand that Emma Smith's murder drops off this list quite quickly. And the reason is because it was different to the crimes that were following. But people have since dropped Martha's off the list of Jack the Ripper crimes for a couple of reasons. Firstly, one medical person said that the perpetrator was definitely right-handed when it came to Martha. And yet, I've never really brought this up in this series yet, but because it was said that Jack the Ripper had to be left-handed because the way the cuts were done, and a medical examiner actually stated that. Though it was disputed even by medical people back in that day, the common misconception is that the Ripper had to be left-handed, and it mainly took hold because people back in that day thought left-handed people must have had something wrong with them and the devil was in them. So naturally this psychopath had to be left-handed, which I find slightly confronting because don't tell anyone but I am left-handed. So maybe I should be on the Ripper list. Who knows? But the thing was, when people believed that these crimes against Martha were committed by a right-handed person, well then they said, well, she couldn't have been a Ripper victim. Added to that, they say that all the Ripper victims were strangled. And yet Martha wasn't. So therefore she could not have been a Ripper victim. She was just violently attacked with a knife many, many times. And so there was not the mutilation that happened to the others. I find that really, really odd, just quietly, and how that possibly could have been the case. Because of the Hewitts. Now, if someone is being attacked in that building right outside your door and they are not unconscious, you're not just hearing murder once. There's a commotion going on. You would have had to have heard something. Even if the person was unconscious, I would find it strange that you didn't hear what was going on outside. So I don't know if anyone's ever really looked into the Hewitts at all, about their story or situation. I'd be interested in that. So if you know any information, throw that down in comments, because their whole story just seems a bit off to me. It doesn't quite add up. But the other thing with the strangulation is the photos they show at the mortuary for Martha do suggest that perhaps she was asphyxiated first. Now, there's no definite proof to say she was, just as though there's no definite proof to say she wasn't. In fact, it would seem more likely that she was. Also, the position of most of the victims, how they were found, matches the ones that are considered Jack the Ripper victims. And we're going to cover one that is definitely considered one of the 5 victims that doesn't match any of this anyway. So why she is discounted as being an official Ripper victim so quickly today, I'm not 100% sure. Now, I'm not saying that Jack the Ripper performed the crime against Martha, but you might want to check out what I think of the Jack the Ripper saga as I'm saying this as well. Maybe not necessarily the same person perpetrated all the crimes. But also what is of note is Pearly Pole disappeared. Not permanently, she did come back up, but when the inquest was on, they couldn't find her. And eventually she did surface and came forward, but she could never identify the soldiers. In fact, she said, oh, no, you're looking at the wrong soldier brigade. It wasn't them, it was this other mob. And all of them had rock-solid alibis, which suggests that either she was not wanting to get someone into trouble, because maybe she knew they couldn't have done the crimes, all they did was go off together, so no need to cast aspersions against them, or she knew that they had committed the crimes, and therefore was worried for her own safety. It's possible she knew something else and didn't want to come forward because maybe no one would believe her, but then there is also still that gang theory that floats around that maybe she knew who did this crime, but she did not want to put herself out there once again for her own safety. Well, we don't know. But that also, to me, needs answering. Why was Pearly Pole so reluctant to come forward with any information about what happened? So like all the other 4 victims we've discussed up to now, no one was ever caught and no one was ever charged for the murder of Martha Turner Tabram White. Well, that will change when we go on to our 6th victim. So this is the first of the official Jack the Ripper victims as it is considered today. And it was Mary Ann Nichols, commonly known as Polly Nichols, but she was born in 1845 as Mary Ann Walker. Yet it was in 1864 that she got married to William Nichols. And then, starting from 1866, so when she was about 21 years old, she had her first child, and they had 5 children together, the last one being born in 1879. So that's quite the time span between the children. Now, there could be reasons for this gap as well, not just because it just happened that way, but they did have a volatile relationship, William and Polly. They split up many, many times during their life, but then got back together again. It was in 1881, so their last child was only 2 years old, that they split up permanently. And it is important to note that at about the age of 21, it could have been a bit before, but her oldest son, Edward, also moved out of the home and went to live with Polly's father. And that detail is important at the end. Now, it is important to note that why they separated is a matter of conjecture. It's stated that Polly suggested he was having an affair, which he doesn't deny that he was starting to see someone else, but he said that only happened after Polly left. That is also something we will touch on a bit later, because I do think it just tells more of Polly's story as well. Yet her life doesn't go very well. Now, it is suggested that she formed a relationship with someone for a little while during the time between 1881 and 1888, but that would appear to be a very brief thing if it did happen properly, as has been suggested. But what we do see in Polly's life is she is now going from workhouse to workhouse. So in 1888, though, there's just a little detail here which is fascinating, that she sent a letter to her father saying, look, I've got a good situation now. I've got a job in service. So she was working in someone's house. So she's no longer at the lodging houses. She's no longer on the streets. And she said, these people are great. They don't drink. I'm going to get along really well here. Probably meaning that this is going to sort out her life. And she also asked, does the boy have work? Which is obviously referring to her oldest son. Now, I don't know if she ever got a response back from that letter. Have not been able to find it. But sadly, it didn't take long before she got fired from that job for stealing. So, unfortunately, this did not work out well for her, and she's back out in workhouses and in the doss houses. Now, a doss house, we don't use that term. It's an English term. When I say we, most people, other than if you're English, use that term. In the United States, I believe it's called a flop house. In Australia, we'd probably refer to a bunk house. But regardless, we get the idea. You're bunking down with other people. It's cheap accommodation. And the doss houses in England allowed a man and a woman to share the room, which are the more reputable places of accommodation would not allow that unless you were married. But the doss house, well, they would look the other way, so you just needed to get your doss money. And it was on this night, August 31st of 1888, that Polly Nichols is challenged by the manager of a particular doss house where she often stayed. So she had a regular room at this place, and he said, look, where's your money? And she said, you keep that room. I'm going to go out and get my doss money now. But she also made a strange comment about what a pretty bonnet I have now. But she said to a friend that she had her doss money already that night 3 times over. So what did she do with that money? Well, she'd gone down to the pub and spent it on gin. A large glass of gin. 3 times. Because the doss money, the same amount of money that you could pay for your room, was the same amount of money they would charge you for a large glass of gin. So she'd had 3 of these gins already. Now, I don't know exactly what a large glass of gin would have been, but if it was a reasonable, even tumbler, you're probably getting close to drinking a bottle of gin already. And it is said that she was rather tipsy. The effects of alcohol were obviously evident. And the last she is seen is walking down the road by herself. But then it was around, and we don't know exactly when, but around 3:45 in the morning, that a man by the name of Charles Cross comes across this person lying on the ground. He sees another person walking down the street and calls him over, who happened to be Robert Paul. And we might think these 2 blokes were up to no good because they're walking down the road at 3:45 in the morning, yet that was the regular time when the city started coming to life, because that was rush hour. People are heading off to work. Now, they were walking to work on a bit of a lit up road. So Polly Nichols is lying on the pavement not far from one of these main thoroughfares. But Charles Cross says this person is dead. Robert Paul feels that there's still warmth on the body and says, no, actually, I think there's even a heartbeat. I think she's still alive. But then Charles Cross says, well, look, we got to make her look respectable, and asked Robert Paul to help adjust the body, is the term that was used. And he says, I'm not having a bar of that. Now, that is odd. I just want to point out, not getting into this Charles Cross Robert Paul situation in this video. That will be coming later. There is a lot to deep dive about what happened here. But the important thing to note is Robert Paul thought she was still alive. But they decide together that they can't be late for work, and off they go. But a policeman, only a few minutes later, so they've already taken off, but only a couple of minutes later, a policeman came across the body. These 2 blokes are said to have seen a policeman and said, hey, you're wanted back there because there's a body. But the policeman calls the doctor at 4 a.m. So 15 minutes later, the doctor is called. Now, we don't know exactly how long it took the doctor to turn up on the scene, but he soon pronounces her dead. But the thing that he says is she's only been dead for a couple of minutes. So Robert Paul's assumption or feeling was probably correct, that she hadn't died yet. It's not to say they could have saved her with CPR, no, because this crime was really bad. There was the cut to the throat and also some vital body parts removed. Polly Nichols was not going to survive. But this particular crime made headlines because of the graphic nature of it. And a big inquest was held where they were dragging people back. So Charles Cross, Robert Paul, other people were being questioned about this event. And the papers linked Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, and Polly Nichols all together for this particular one. Now that does change as we go through this. But right now, the media explosion happened, and people were getting worried about who was out there committing these atrocities. Now, unlike the others, quite a few people were charged over this crime, but no one was ever convicted. But what is of note, and I think as regards Polly Nichols, at her funeral, so her funeral costs were paid by 3 people. Her father, her ex-husband, William Nichols, and her son, Edward. They all chipped in for the burial. Now, what is of note is that at the funeral, Edward, her oldest son, did not have any interactions with his father. So that would suggest that William's story as to why those two separated may not be 100% accurate, but rather his telling of it. Because Edward would have been old enough to know what was going on in the house. I mean, kids at a young age are fairly sharp, but this older son had grown up seeing the interactions and the separations. He would have really known what happened in that house. And so that does tell a story. And so for him to see then his mother going on a path of self-destruction, no doubt him thinking that it was caused by his father kicking her out of the house, because what could she do? And William cut off financial support. So Polly Nichols was a victim of circumstance here. It's easy to judge, say, well, what a terrible lifestyle for a mother of 5 to get into. But what would you do back then? And unfortunately for her, yes, it did end up costing her life. And sadly, we only know about Polly Nichols because of her connection to Jack the Ripper. But who is the next person on this list? The next person on this list is the second official victim of Jack the Ripper, Annie Chapman. Now, she was born in 1841, and her father's last name was Smith, and her mother's maiden name was Chapman, which is interesting. They got married 6 months after Annie was born, which I think would have been scandalous possibly back in those days. Yet they had more children, but Annie was the oldest of the siblings. Now, it's said that Annie started drinking alcohol at a fairly young age. So as she's growing up, her younger siblings even are concerned about this habit and try to help her, but they say not with much result. The general consensus of Annie is she was really brilliant and could do almost anything when sober. But when affected by alcohol, well, things weren't so good. Now, the family moved away, but left Annie behind when, obviously, she was a bit older. Not that there was anything, really untoward there. It's just that it said that she had a job in service. So she was employed in housekeeping. And so it just made sense that she would stay and work because jobs were a premium back then. But it was in 1868 that she married John Chapman. Now, it is suggested that perhaps this was some relative of her mother's, but it's also possible that it was just a different person named Chapman because there were many Chapmans around at the time. But in 1870, they had their first child, Emily. They also had another daughter in the mid-70s. And then finally, in 1880, they had a son who was also named John. Now, they were known to be heavy drinkers. Whether or not that got them together, I don't know, but they were hooking into alcohol very, very solidly, despite the fact they were able to still carry on a relatively normal life. Their son, John, though, did have a disability, and this triggered them both to clean up their lives and stop drinking. And they were doing very well. But they couldn't look after John, and he had to go into a home for the disabled, which today I doubt would happen. There would be the supports, there'd be the help. But back then, that pretty well much was the only option available. And then it was in 1882, their oldest daughter, Emily, passed away. This event triggered them both back to drinking very heavily. And in 1884, it said by mutual consent, they split up. Yet it is of note that John kept sending money to Annie, 10 shillings a week after the breakup. So she wasn't on the street. She wasn't destitute. And Annie sort of moved on with a bloke called Civvy, who used to make sieves. So I'm guessing that was a nickname of his because of the occupation he was in. But then at the end of 1886, the money stopped. So now Annie's making inquiries as to, hang on, where's this weekly cash that I've been getting? And she finds out that her ex-husband passed away on Christmas Day, 1886. And he died from cirrhosis of the liver and effects of heavy drinking. Well, when Civvy finds out the money stopped, he takes off. He just leaves Annie to herself. Now, how is she going to start making money? She does sell trinkets and flowers and just do the regular hawking on the street. Somewhere along the line, she does fall into working the streets for money. She is in a lodging house. I believe the name was Crossingham's Lodging House. And she was well liked there. Sometimes a couple of the guys there would pay for her room for the night if she didn't have the money. But there was also issues there too. Apparently there was a woman, Eliza Cooper, and her and Annie didn't really get along. It suggested that maybe there was competing affections for a bloke or something. But it was in September of 1888 that Eliza and Annie got into a fight, either at a pub over one of these blokes or at the lodging house over a bar of soap. Now, there are differing reports of what happened there, but there is definite fact that Annie ended up with a bit of a black eye, a bit of a shiner from this particular fight with Eliza. But it was the late afternoon on September the 7th, 1888, that Annie's not feeling very well. Now, she did have some health issues, and one of her friends checked in on her. But eventually Annie said, look, I can't sit here doing nothing. I've got to go out and make my money, or I won't have a roof over my head tonight. It's said that she returned to that lodging house at 11:30, and she had a bit of food, but she didn't have the money for the room yet. But at 1:35, she runs into the night watchman. So he's saying, look, need your money for your room, because she had a regular room at this lodging house. She said, look, I don't have it, but don't let it out, because I will be back with the money. And off she goes. But it was said that maybe she'd already had a beer or two before she got back to that lodging house, and that night watchman said, look, you find money to get your beer, but you can't pay for your room. But it was around 5:30 a.m. in the morning at 29 Hanbury Street that someone sees Annie with a bloke. And he's got a coat and hat on, apparently. And there's varying reports of the type of hat. So not long after the sighting of Annie, a bloke next door in 27 goes out to use the outhouse. So it's starting to get light now. But he hears some noise, hears someone say no, and then sounded like somebody falling. But there was a 5-foot fence, and he probably couldn't exactly see exactly what's going on. But, you know, things happened back then. He doesn't think anything more of it. But at about 6 a.m., a bloke who lived in 29 Hanbury Street with his family comes down and sees Annie. And yes, she has passed away. And she has been brutally murdered. The medical report states that no doubt strangulation occurred first, and then the rest of what the Jack the Ripper person did after that. It's of note, though, that the medical person also was extensive in his comments that Annie wasn't healthy. She was very malnourished. Her whole system was probably on the way of shutting down. Now, that does not justify the crime at all, but she was 47 years old. Her ex-husband had passed away from the effects of extreme alcohol use, and it seemed that she was not too far away from that happening to herself. Now, interestingly, the relatives did look after the funeral, but they made sure nobody knew about it. They made it very, very quiet, because this had made some major press. And so they managed to do the funeral in a very secretive way, which I think you could understand, because this was starting to turn into a media circus. But they find a leather apron underneath the tap. So someone had been trying to wash a leather apron right near where the crime happened. And it belonged to a bloke by the name of John Richardson, and the police went through him like a dose of salts. But they find that he had nothing to do with it. His mother had just tried to wash his leather apron. But the press picked up on this leather apron story, and they ran with, "We have to catch Leather Apron." So this media reporting led to the arrest of John Pfizer, who was known as Leather Apron. And particularly he was known as that by Sergeant Thick, and we actually covered that in the very first video that kicked off this Jack the Ripper series. But it also led to the arrest of other people. Many, well, I won't say many, but about 5 to 6 people at least got dragged in for questioning over this particular crime and the one before it, because the media attention on it now was really putting the pressure on the police. And what is also interesting, that there was pressures coming from other areas. You see, the local authorities were saying, "We need more police. We got to catch this bloke. No one's safe anymore. So, get more police on the streets." And the police were saying, "Well, how about you fix your lighting? There's no point of having the police out on the street if we can't see a thing." And both of the problems cost money. The local authorities said, well, it costs too much money to fix the lighting. And the police were saying it costs us a lot of money to put more police on the streets. So things really haven't changed today, have they, when departments start blaming each other and trying to pass the buck. But this was an escalation in the public's mind about these crimes happening. And it was after this event that many papers were being sold, and letters were starting to come into the papers with information about this person who was the perpetrator of these atrocities. So who is the next person then on this list? So the next person on this list is Elizabeth Stride, who many people consider to be the third official victim of Jack the Ripper, though this one is the most controversial as regards whether it should be included on this list, as we'll see at the end. And yet Elizabeth Stride was totally different to many of the others on this list. To start with, she wasn't actually English or even Irish, but she was born in Sweden. Now, I don't know much about Sweden at all. I think ABBA came from there, and Muppet Chef. And that's as far as my knowledge on Sweden goes. So if you want to educate me on Sweden, then put that down in comments. But family weren't wealthy, but they weren't totally broke. But she seems to have had a connection to the Swedish church throughout her entire life, though it is stated, and I find this interesting, that she could read okay, but it was said that she never really understood the Bible at all. She managed to get some work through the church in some domestic capacity. Yet at some point, she turned to making money in other ways. So in 1865, so she would have only been 22 years old, she gets arrested for being a woman of the night. Sadly for her, 2 events happen here. One, she did contract a communicable disease, but worse is she did fall pregnant, and that baby didn't survive childbirth. Now, her reasons to emigrate to England are very dubious, because she gave differing reports as to why she was going to go to England. But it could have been this loss of the child that really affected her emotionally, and she just wanted a fresh start. So in 1866, she does emigrate to England, basically making these connections with the Swedish church over there as well. But then in 1869, she marries a person by the name of John Stride. And it seems that this was quite a good relationship, at least for a few years, because they ran a cafe or coffee shop together from 1870 to 1875. And during that time, they actually changed the location of the business. And that would have taken a fair bit of work and effort, but obviously it was successful. And then someone in 1875 took that business over. Things get very strange here. because we don't really know much detail what happened between 1875 and 1878. But in 1878, a massive event happened. Two ships, the Princess Alice and the Bywell Castle, collided, and 600 to 700 people lost their lives. They really don't know because there was no solid manifest of who was on those boats at the time. But Elizabeth Stride says that she was on that boat, herself with her husband and children. So she tries to climb the mast to get up out of this sinking ship, and she gets kicked in the teeth and she loses all her teeth on the bottom jaw. But she says, sadly, her husband and children passed away in that accident, which would be absolutely dreadful if that was true, because there is absolutely no record that John and Elizabeth had any kids. In fact, they're recorded as having no children. And what's more, John Stride didn't die until 1864 of heart disease. So was she even on that boat? Yes, it is true she had no teeth on her bottom jaw. How that happened, well, even the doctors themselves at her autopsy really couldn't explain it. But what we do know is her and John were separated at this point. But she may have told this story to get money from the church because she was receiving support from time to time, as we will see. But in around 1881, she's in the workhouses, in and out around the Whitechapel area. But then in 1885, she meets a man, or at least starts living with a bloke, Michael Kidney. So in 1885, she's now living with a bloke, Michael Kidney. But their relationship was rocky at the very best, we would say. He says that Elizabeth, or Long Liz as her nickname was getting into the drink a bit. And when she had the drink, she was a bit more boisterous than normal, and that would be true, as we will see as we go through. He said he tried to help her because she'd go off at night and he'd not see her for a while, and she'd come home drunk if she came home at all. So he thought he'd be helpful and lock her in the house to protect her from herself. And interestingly, a padlock was actually found on her body. She accuses him of domestic assault, and he goes to court. She doesn't turn up to court, so that gets thrown out. But in the 20 months prior to her death, she's arrested at least 8 times and goes before the court for drunk and disorderly behaviour with obscene language. But what is really of interest is in September of 1888, both on the 15th and the 20th, she's gone to the Swedish church and they have provided her with some money. But now on September the 29th, and I'd suggest it's the 29th because of what happens next, she's cleaning some rooms at the lodging house where she was staying. She gets paid by a person, Elizabeth Tanner, and they both go off to drink at 6:30 p.m. Now they're at the Queen's Head pub, not for very long because she's seen back at the lodging house between 7 and 8, and then she's leaving. And most people say that she was in good spirits. She wasn't drunk or disorderly at all. The next suggested sighting of her is 2 labourers are going into the Bricklayers Arms pub. They see Long Liz and a bloke leave. He's described as short, dark moustache, and sandy eyelashes. I find all those details, at least that last detail, very intriguing because it was dark. It was 11 p.m. at night. And you got 2 labourers just walking into a pub and you're going to pay that much attention to another bloke's eyelashes? I find that odd. But anyway, that was the description they gave. But then at 11:45, she's next seen on Burner Street talking to some bloke. And I say talking, but yeah, carrying on a bit. Getting rather up close and personal, we would say, with a bloke who has a sailor hat on. But then almost an hour later, around 12:35, PC Smith sees Elizabeth Stride with what I would say a different bloke. A 28-year-old bloke, had a waistcoat and a deerstalker hat, and was carrying a parcel wrapped in newspaper. But only 10 minutes later, a bloke by the name of Israel Swartz sees a bloke pushing a woman to the ground. He doesn't want to get involved, and that seems to be a bit of a common thread back then, so he crosses the street, but then he sees another bloke lighting a pipe, and then he's apparently called out something along the lines of Lipsky, and Israel does not want to hang around. So he starts walking away, but the guy with the pipe starts following him, so he says that he just books it, like he's running for his life, and the bloke doesn't catch up with him. He's dragged in when they have Elizabeth Stride at the mortuary, and he says, yeah, no, that was the person I saw being attacked. But that was a totally different description to what PC Smith saw only 10 minutes prior. So if his statement is true, we may have two people last seen with Elizabeth Stride. So at 1 a.m. in the morning, a jewellery salesman goes into Dutfield Yard. Except his horse wouldn't go in. He kept rearing back. So he's wondering what's going on. So he gets his whip, because he had a whip, and he's ferreting around in the ground because he said it was pitch black, could not see a thing, finds a body. He thinks someone's probably either sleeping or drunk. So he goes into the building. People come out. They find Elizabeth Stride. She's passed away. They call the doctor, and at 1:16, he pronounces her dead on the scene. And only her throat was cut. And I say only, I know that's absolutely dreadful, but it wasn't the same as the other Ripper crimes. Now, this jewellery salesman says he believes that the Ripper was in that yard because that's why the horse kept acting so weird. And no doubt when he went into the building, the Ripper got away. And hence why no further injuries were inflicted on Elizabeth Stride. Now, before the press could respond to this particular crime, and before the police could even get their hands on this properly, another attack is going to happen in Whitechapel that very evening. So less than an hour later, Katherine Eddowes would be found at 1:45 a.m. in the morning in Mitre Square. But who was Katherine Eddowes? Well, she was born in Wolverhampton in 1842. There's a lot of discrepancy to do with some of her history, so we'll try to stick with what is definite. But in 1848, there was a tin plate strike in Wolverhampton. So all the tin plate workers said, well, forget this, we need more money. Catherine's father and uncle packed up both their families and decided to walk to London, which is at least 2 days if you're walking day and night. So that would have taken at least a week, I would suggest, particularly with kids in tow. Because they were looking to find some jobs, like so many people were, moving to the big cities where the opportunities lay. Now, exactly what happened after that is debatable. Though I think the most likely story that I've seen is that her father actually passed away in 1851 in London, and then his brother moved back to Wolverhampton, and so did she, and stayed with her aunt. Now, it was here in Wolverhampton that she met Thomas Clancy. Their relationship and exactly what went on there is also a matter of conjecture, but it's said that they had 3 children between 1865 and 1873. But in 1881, Thomas and Katherine split up. They took a child each, it's stated, and Katherine ended up with the oldest daughter, and she soon married, and appears distanced herself from her mother after marriage and just sort of moved away a little bit. So following that breakup and her daughter moving away, she appears in lodging houses. But it's said that she's not known to be walking the streets at night or getting drunk constantly. Yes, a few times she might go off and have a few drinks. But she meets a person by the name of John Kelly. Now, he seems to be in fairly stable employment. They form a relationship. So John and Katherine every year would go hop picking. So in England in September, when the crops were ready, the farmers would write to people that didn't probably have stable employment and say, come on out and do this job, and you could make some money and go back to the city. Now, it's said in 1888 that John and Katherine headed off to do hop picking in September, but something didn't work out. The situation wasn't right, and so they decide just to head back to London. Now, they get back to London in round about the 28th of September, and they are flat broke. Now, John manages to get some money, and so Katherine says, well, look, you take most of it, I'll take a little bit. I can go stay at this other dump of a place. You go to the lodging house, and we'll catch up later. But on the 29th of September 1888 at 8 a.m., Katherine takes John's boots to the pawn shop at his request. And they put them in the shop, and she uses the name Jane Kelly, and she gets the money. At 8 p.m. that night, P.C. Robinson sees a crowd milling on the street, goes over and finds a woman just unconscious on the ground. Another policeman comes along. They manage to lift her up, but she is blind, rotten, drunk. None of the crowd that were hanging around were very useful. They weren't helping the poor woman, and when the police say, well, does anyone know who this is? No one gives an answer at all. So, like, charming group of people that was, and it does turn out to be Katherine Eddowes. So they take her back to the police station. So at 8:45 p.m, she is locked up in the cell. See, at 12:15 a.m, so we're now moved to September the 30th, 1888, she's heard singing in her prison cell. And apparently she could sing really well and sang quite often. And then she requests to be let out. Now, this was a regular thing. So they'd find these drunks on the street, they'd lock them up for a while, and once they sobered up, okay, you're good to go. So the policeman in there says, look, once you can look after yourself, then we'll let you out. But she had not given her name yet. When asked her name prior to this, the recorded response is she said nothing. Now, either she actually said nothing or she refused to answer the question. It's sort of hard to determine from the police report, but she never gave her name. But when it was about 12:55, she gave her name as Mary Ann Kelly and gave an address which she didn't reside at. So she obviously didn't really want her own name attached to this bit of stupidity that she did by getting drunk. But they let her go. See, had they not let her out in that moment, she may not have suffered the fate that she soon would. Remembering around this time, the body of Elizabeth Stride was being discovered. And just minutes before, here is Katherine Eddowes walking out of the prison. But now at 1:35 a.m, a group of men, Joseph Levy, Joseph Laundy, and Harry Harris, see Katherine Eddowes talking to a bloke. And they say she had her arms up, but not in a defensive way. Now, knowing that she was not known to be a woman of the night as such, we do wonder what the conversation was that happened. But they were near what was known as Church Passage, which led directly into Mitre Square. And at 1:45 p.m, a policeman finds the dead body of Katherine Eddowes. And yes, this was a full Ripper crime in every sense of the word. So she was last seen alive only 10 minutes prior. Now, Mitre Square was just right there, so they did not have to walk far. But that is very scary to know that this atrocity just occurred so quickly and no one saw a thing. But the media absolutely latched on to these two crimes. Elizabeth Stride and Katherine Eddowes, the infamous double event. And even though Ripper hysteria had started, this now ramped it up massively. But now the police were arresting people on even the flimsiest of reasons. Alfred Blanchard happens to be one of those. There were others that were actually held in custody for quite some time until it could be proven without doubt that they could not have committed these crimes. The Vigilance Committee now was in full swing. The public are like screaming, what on earth is going on? How are these atrocities happening? And yet there was another crime in between the next official Jack the Ripper victim. We need to step back just a little bit right now, because it was not long after the Annie Chapman murder that a right arm was found in the River Thames. Initially, the papers reported this as being probably a bit of a joke. A little prankster's gone out to have a bit of a laugh and take a limb off a body and just, get everyone sort of worked up about it, particularly because the papers were already starting to report about the Jack the Ripper crimes. But then it was during the construction of the new Scotland Yard building that a worker in a basement found a parcel and a trunk. The trunk had a torso in it. And this occurred on October the 2nd, so only 3 days after the so-called double event of the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Katherine Eddowes. Now, not only had they just found the torso, but some body parts had been removed as well. Now, the papers went absolutely nuts over this. Because the double event had happened, the media storm was so big, and then this torso was found, and they've blown it up, saying, look, this crazy person is going nuts, killing people, and now look what he is doing. Yet, it has to be noted that when they did the tests on this torso, they did find that the right arm that was found in the river belonged to this torso. But the person had been killed well before in August. And it has to be said that the person wasn't an unfortunate. They were well nourished. They said that, according to everything, it didn't look like they'd even done a lot of hard work, and also the dress that was found was probably only a pattern that was 3 years old, so it appears that it was someone with a little bit of means. Yet, no one ever was identified as this victim. And also no one was ever identified as the perpetrator of this crime, because the police said, despite what the media was saying, they said there is no connection to the Ripper crimes. This is a different event. Though it has been noted that it is rather ironic that one of the most bizarre unsolved murders, which fell within the Thames torso murders, was discovered at the new Scotland Yard building. But what I found even more disturbing is in 2017, someone released a board game, The Whitehall Mystery, where you actually basically reenact this, try and find different locations and the person doing it. But someone said, look, I could probably help out. They got a sniffer dog and they actually found the left leg of the person. And that's all they ever found. But what's of note is this type of crime had been happening prior. But the press were quick to try and lump it in together with the Jack the Ripper saga. But it wasn't long before the media had something to really sink their teeth into. So no official Ripper crime happened in all of October of 1888. But on November the 9th of 1888, the final official Jack the Ripper crime occurred. And it was Mary Kelly. A lot of the information we know about Mary Kelly comes from Joseph Barnett, so we have to take some of that with a grain of salt, because one, he could have been telling his own story, because he was questioned very solidly about the Jack the Ripper crimes, because when Mary Kelly was murdered, it appeared very likely that someone who knew her had committed this atrocity. But what we do know that she was roughly born in 1863 somewhere in Ireland, and either the family moved to Wales or she left the family. Joseph Barnett said she had very little contact with the family at all. Other people dispute that, but I sort of lean towards Joseph Barnett's opinion on this, because at her funeral it was stated that no family could be contacted. So even if she was still in touch, obviously it was very sparse and they weren't easily contactable to come for her funeral. Now, it's stated in her short life she had various boyfriends leading up to meeting Joseph Barnett. It's also thought that she could have been a high-class escort, so not working the streets as such, but definitely someone that could charge a fair bit for their company. But then for some reason, around 1886, that just doesn't really work out, and she is actually walking the streets like an unfortunate. So she has stayed in some of these lodging houses like the other women in this saga have done as well. But somewhere along the way she meets Joseph Barnett. Now he's in gainful employment and they take up a residence in various places. But in 1888, early 1888, they move into 13 Miller's Court. Now, we have covered Joseph Barnett in this series, and yes, he lost his job, and so then Mary had to make money. Now, it's said that she started going out back on the streets, and Joseph Barnett said, "That won't do at all, I am out of here." Yet, he later states that it wasn't her working the streets at all, because she wasn't doing that. What he had a problem with was her letting some of these women of the night stay there at 13 Miller's Court. He said one night they were even there sleeping, and she lets some other woman come and stay in the room as well. And remember, this is only a one-room place. It wasn't big by any stretch of the imagination, but it was more secure than a lodging house. And that is important to note, because it does show she had more permanent residency than most of the ones that we've discussed so far. Now, even though Joseph Barnett and Mary have split up, they caught up almost daily, it is said. And Joseph Barnett later states that he regrets leaving because she'd probably still be alive if he had hung around. Whilst Mary was very well known as a likeable person, it said that when she had a few beverages into her, she could get very fiery, but then so could Joseph Barnett, and they used to fight now and then. In fact, at 13 Miller's Court, it was said during an altercation a window was broken. So we can understand why the police would have looked at him in that instance. But what happened there on the night of November the 8th? It says that Mary Kelly ran into a woman, Lizzie Albrook, and she was telling her, "Don't go down the same path I have. Like, it's not worth it." In other words, don't go walking the street. She bemoaned to other people that she wanted to go back to Ireland where her people were, where life was so much better rather than being in this drab and dreary area of Whitechapel, staying in this one little room apartment. Now, it said that Joseph Barnett did come and visit, but at 8 p.m. he left for his lodging. And there's a few other differing reports about what happened in between there, but the next official confirmed sighting of Mary Kelly was at 11 p.m. and she was drinking with a young bloke at the Britannia pub. But then, at 11:45 p.m., a person by the name of Mary Cox sees Mary Kelly with a stout bloke, carroty mustache. And he was carrying something, but it was said it was a pail of beer. Yet it said that bloke left, and Mary Kelly is now in her room from 12:30 p.m. and she starts singing. And apparently someone living above her was a bit annoyed and wanted to go down and sort out and say, look, cut the noise down, it's late. But the husband of this person said, look, leave that poor woman alone, just let us sing. But then, later on, nothing really is heard from Mary Kelly's room. There's no noise and no light from about 1:30 on. Yet, George Hutchinson is on the scene and he says he sees her around 2 a.m. in the street and asks for some money, which he says, look, I've got no money. If you want to check out that story, that has been covered in this Jack the Ripper saga. Now, the question we have to ask here, is that story true? Because he then says he saw someone with her and he got a real good look at this person. And that was the last reported official sighting of Mary Kelly before going into 13 Miller's Court with this strange person. I have to ask, though, did that happen? Or was that just a total fabricated story? And I ask that because it stated definitely from 3 a.m. in the morning there was no sound or light coming from that room. And Hutchinson said he hung around outside for an hour. Someone, though, in that building around 4 a.m. thought they heard someone call out murder, but that wasn't that uncommon. So, didn't think anything more of it and just went straight back to sleep. Now, there are some other reported sightings of Mary Kelly after this event. One person said, no, I definitely saw her around 10 a.m., but police doubt the person had the right day, even though that person was adamant that they saw her. So a bloke by the name of Maurice Lewis reports that he saw Mary Kelly and Joseph Barnett drinking at 10 p.m. the night before. But they soon just discount what he's saying, and they don't even ask him to come to the inquest because that information does not appear to be accurate. But at 10:45, the landlord goes to collect the money. Knocks on the door, no answer. So he goes and looks in the window and sees the body. They go to the police. They come back. They're waiting for someone to come and open the door, but eventually the police just say, look, knock it down. They get in there and they find, obviously, Mary Kelly deceased. But the clothes are neatly stacked on the chair. And it's not like the room had been ransacked in any way. But here is an important detail. The police report, the official police report of the crime scene, and the media reports of what they said happened vary greatly. The media reports made it look very ritualistic, like something really strange was going on in that room. And that's not to say that something horrific didn't happen, because it did. But it wasn't as ritualistic as the papers were making it out to be. But right now, Ripper hysteria is just launched into the stratosphere. Because this crime was the absolute worst of them all. Now, I will not go into the gory details nor put up any of the photos of that crime scene. They are available if you want to go looking for them. I would encourage you not to, because you probably don't need to see them. But this was different, and this made people even more scared, because here was someone with a permanent residence inside that house, and they were not safe. So not just the police and the papers were getting worried about this. Now the general public were too, as is seen in the next person we're going to discuss. So on November the 21st, 1888, only a short time after the Mary Kelly murders, two interesting events happened. One of them really revolves around Annie Farmer, who had been in a relationship. She also had some other aliases, but she was now back on the streets working as an unfortunate and staying in lodging houses. Now, the first version of this story is that she met a young bloke of shabby description, it is said, and in the morning. So they've met up around 7:30 in the morning, and they decide to maybe get to know each other a little bit more. And they go to quite a high establishment, Satchel's Lodging House on George Street. And it must have been a very well-to-do lodging house because they were that busy. Sometimes you could only rent the rooms by the hour. So they get the hourly rate and decide to get to know each other a little bit better. But after a little while, Annie screams out murder. And the bloke that she was with bolted. I'm talking took off. He would have resembled Usain Bolt's younger brother Insane, because he's doing the Insane Bolt and he's not stopping for anybody. Apparently ran past a group of people saying women be crazy, or words to those effect, and also, it's reported, ran past 2 police officers. Well, the police get and see Annie and find she is actually bleeding from the neck. But they also note that she's got some coins under her tongue, which was a way some of these women would perhaps rob someone and then hide the coins. And the police note that the wound on her neck really wasn't caused by anything sharp. So now they're thinking this may have just been a bit of robbery happening. Annie fleecing some bloke of his cash without perhaps performing the regular business transaction that would happen in those circumstances. So they decide to just let it go, and they expect the person to come forward, perhaps to reclaim his money. He could report the robbery. But could you imagine that actually happening? Would you go back under those circumstances after you've seen what's happened to Alfred Blanchard, John Pfizer, and many others that have been mentioned in this series? The press would have absolutely hung you out to dry. Yet, we would ask, well, why didn't he hang around? Well, we'll get back to that after we consider the second version of this event. See, other press reports said that it was a known person to Annie that she was with, a former acquaintance. And it said that the police therefore knew who this acquaintance was, and they would go and catch up with him because people knew his name, but he didn't have any permanent lodgings. But it was only a matter of time before they found him. And yet this story just died away, just wasn't considered anymore after these reports in the press. So why did the bloke just run without looking back when he's lost his money? Now, if he didn't have a house, that money was probably important to him. Well, I would suggest his life was more important. See, the people on the street were that angry about these crimes that if they had have thought they were catching Jack the Ripper, they probably would not have waited for the police to take any action. They would have meted out justice on the spot. And hence why he ran for his life and was not ever turning around to come back. And this is a very valid concern because the papers actually referred to this event as an outrage. The outrage being that the person, whether Annie knew him or not, ran past 2 policemen and they did not try to catch him, and the public were furious over this. Even though the police said, look, there was nothing to see here. It was just a bit of petty robbery, and that's all it was. And Annie Farmer, to her last breath though, maintained she was attacked by Jack the Ripper. But it was later that night that a bigger event was recorded in the papers where a bloke attacked an unfortunate with a knife. He ran from the police. They managed to catch him. He resisted arrest, but they ruled him out as being Jack the Ripper. So we start to see the police are beginning to try and dissipate the public's feelings towards the Ripper crimes. Perhaps to stop this vigilante justice being meted out to someone before they can actually investigate a crime. The press, too, aren't blowing it up massively on the front pages as they had. Maybe because this crime just wasn't a real crime in that sense, so wouldn't get the sensational reporting that the others did. But the next one really does start raising some questions. So now, only a month later, on the 20th of December 1888, the next possible victim appears. And that was Rose Mylett. I think that's how that name is said. But what we mostly know about her only comes from her mother, who identified the body, but said she was born in December of 1859. Which means she was only around 25 when she passed away. And that is significant because of what the cause of death was considered to be by some, which we will get to shortly. Yet her mum said that she had married a bloke, had a child together. His name was Davis and he was an upholsterer. Obviously, that relationship didn't really work out because, well, she's working the streets and we really don't know what happened to the child because there's no real record of that. Yet she was known on the street as Drunken Lizzie Davis. She also went by some other names as well, but her mother said her real name was Katherine. But sadly for Rose, the real intriguing part to this comes after her death. So what happened on the night of December 19th to the early mornings of December 20th, 1888? It was 7:55 p.m. and a bloke whose last name was Ptolemy saw Rose on the Poplar High Street near Clark's Yard, and he said that she was in good spirits and appeared totally sober. But then at 2:30 a.m, Alice Graves sees Rose outside the George Hotel on Commercial Street, and she said she was very drunk. That's important to note as well. But then at 4:15 a.m, Police Sergeant Golding comes across a body and he says it was still warm inside Clark's Yard, and he also said that it appeared to look like the way the Ripper crimes were when they were found. But he doesn't say ever that it was a Ripper crime. But that was his first observation, which is also important to note. And yes, it is the body of Rose, who has passed away. It is important to note that there was no mutilation on this one, not even a cut anywhere to be found. But the police sergeant, his first observation, I think is very interesting, and that he may have come across this body very soon after death. Now, what I am suggesting here is that the perpetrator of this crime may have got interrupted the same way Elizabeth Stride's perpetrator was interrupted and took off before they could do anything more. And I state that because the medical evidence is very, very contradictory. Because the first doctor to examine the body, Dr. Brownfield, was very detailed, and he said there's evidence of strangulation. In fact, a 4-cord thread being used. And he said there were some marks on the neck of someone like trying to get the cord off, as if you're trying to scratch away. Oddly though, Dr. Anderson, who examined the body later, made the statement that there was no evidence of strangulation at all. And in fact, how the body was found, well, it was found as a body would lay naturally. To my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but to my knowledge, he never examined the body in situ. He didn't see it. He saw this body afterwards. So how he could make that statement, I don't know. But he said it was death by natural causes. And the police were pushing for that. They wanted this to be natural causes, so they brought in another doctor, Dr. Bond. And he said there's no evidence of strangulation. She wasn't drunk either. There's no evidence of alcohol in the system, and she was actually well fed. She just had a decent feed. But Dr. Bond also said that there was no evidence of her ever having a child. And that is surprising, considering her mother said that she had. It could be a reason as to why Rose's mother would say that if it wasn't true. But that we'll touch on in the next victim. But I still find that quite a contradiction, because I don't see why the mother necessarily would just make up that story on the surface of it. There's one other bit of detail that Dr. Bond said which I find quite strange, I'll say. But we will get to that. But the coroner, Win Baxter, he's not having this natural causes. He's like, nah, not at all. And he's pushing the jury to say this was murder. Another doctor came in, a Dr. Phillips, and he said not only was it strangulation, the person knew what they were doing. It was done very efficiently and quickly. Now, many people believe that Jack the Ripper was able to immobilize his victims in such a way that not much sound would be made. He could get in, get that job done without anyone noticing. Yet, the other two doctors, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Bond, both still said no, natural causes. And Dr. Anderson maintained that even in his memoir before he passed away. He said this whole case of Rose, massive beat up. Never was a Ripper crime. But Dr. Bond made a funny comment, which I still don't understand how no one jumped on this. He said, well, found no evidence of strangulation, but she may have choked on a stiff velvet collar that she was wearing. I mean, really? What, did she swallow it and choke on it? I mean, if you choked on a collar, would that not be strangulation? Now, I'm no medical doctor, so correct me if I'm wrong in comments, let me know, but I don't see how he could make that statement and maintain that strangulation hadn't occurred. Well, the jury at the coroner found, yes, it was willful murder by person or persons unknown. The police weren't having it, though. They just said, well, thanks, buddy. Thanks, Mr. Baxter. We'll take your judgment, but we're not interested. Why would we waste the resources in chasing down a crime when someone's just fell off the perch due to natural causes? Knowing this isn't long after the Mary Kelly murder. They're straight away dropping this like a hot potato. They want no more to do with it. Because what I find funny is so many of the other Ripper crimes, the people were older. And yes, they were obviously had some health conditions due to their lifestyle. In none of the reports, when they were saying this was natural causes, did they come out and state what exactly happened. Like there was some like heart attack or some organ failure. Nothing. So how did she just drop off the perch? Now, I personally believe an injustice was done to this young woman because the police did not take this seriously. They found medical people to support their view because they weren't wanting to touch this Jack the Ripper case at all anymore. Now, in the official reports, the higher-ups were starting to say that the Ripper's been caught. And I know some people believe that he already had been, and he was locked up already in one of the asylums. But that seems contradictory as we go through a couple more of these possible victims. So a little bit of time has passed now, but 3 kids are playing near the River Thames in the Whitechapel area, and they come across something wrapped in cloth. Well, they take it to the police, and they find out that it was a part of a human body, a human limb. And then 5 miles away, not long after, they find another human limb. So we're talking like 7 to 8 kilometers away. And considering there were no cars, this limbs were found a fair way apart. But then they also find part of a torso. And the torso had injuries similar to what happened to Jack the Ripper victims. Well, Dr. Bond, who we mentioned last time, he's looking into this one initially. So Dr. Bond says that the torso had also had an operation performed on it that was successful, obviously when the person was still alive. Now, it is suggested, because it wasn't stated in his report, but that it could have been a family management operation, and also that a nameless indignity was inflicted on this corpse. And that indignity remained nameless because he didn't state it in the report. But it is obvious that this was not a good thing to have happen. Now, many body parts are found over these next 12 days. And we get the first glimpse of Sir Melville Macnaghten officially appearing on the scene to do some investigation. And he straight away shuts down this as being a Jack the Ripper crime. And we know why. If you've been following this series, you know why he is maintaining that view. The papers are just up in arms saying the Whitechapel fiend has struck again. The public are very much on edge with the discovery of these things because they're now thinking there is this crazy person who has come back because it had gone quiet for a little while. Now, a doctor by the name of Braxton Hicks basically starts putting all the pieces together of these bits that are being found and identifies the body as belonging to Elizabeth Jackson. Yes, he says this was the same person that has been spread around a large area. The family come and also identify the body. There's little doubt, and there was a tiny bit of doubt that this person was Elizabeth Jackson, but there's not much doubt at all that it was her. Now, she was known to be sleeping rough. She was working the streets as well. Friends of hers has said, look, you don't want to be out on the street. Something bad could happen. And she effectively said, look, I can handle it. So the coroner's inquest started and it got delayed because Elizabeth Jackson was known to have a boyfriend, we'd call him John Faircloth. And it said that they had a child together. Now, the thing is, we don't know what happened to that child. It's not really mentioned by the family or by John Faircloth when they catch up with him, because it took them a few weeks before they could track him down. And the police really do investigate him, but find out, no, he definitely was not in the area around June 1889, so they say he could not have perpetrated this crime. But before the verdict was released on what happened to Elizabeth Jackson, which was obvious that it was going to be murder by person or persons unknown, another victim happens during July of 1889. But the police and the papers are now pointing to the Thames torso crimes. And it's even being suggested that perhaps there were two totally diabolical nutcases operating at the same time in the same area. Now, before moving on, there is something really important to mention here, and actually is to do with the Dr. Braxton Hicks. It is not the Dr. Braxton Hicks that the contractions that women have when they're pregnant is named after, even though these two people lived around the same time. But this Dr. Braxton Hicks achieved quite a lot of social reform. Because at the time, in England, if you had a child, you had to insure that child, just in case something happened to it, and so then the funeral arrangements could be looked after. You didn't have to go find money, but you know what happens when you start doing that. Well, insurance and profit and insurance fraud happen quite a lot. So some people were having babies that they didn't actually have the babies, but they were claiming them. And other people were actually having babies and disposing of them to claim the insurance money, and then doing a deal with funeral directors where they could just shove the corpse into someone else's coffin. And therefore they could make money out of this. He shone a light on that practice. And he got the laws changed because of this, that you could no longer insure minor children. And you know what happened? The infant death rate just declined massively before it was skyrocketing. That in itself is absolutely frightening. There were cases around Whitechapel area at the time where people were doing this on a large scale. And I mention that because could you imagine being a policeman investigating all these things at the time? You've got potentially 2 total deranged wackos out there performing horrendous crimes, and you've got regular people doing atrocities as well. And it also may explain why in some of these cases that we've looked at, there's been a child mentioned, but there's no actual evidence of whatever happened to that child or where it ever was. But as we said at that inquest, another victim happened in July of 1889. So what happened there? So in this one, we are looking at Alice McKenzie. So what happened to her? Well, unfortunately, we don't know much about her early life or even hardly anything about her family. It's suggested she was born around 1849, 1850 in Peterborough, and then made the trek down to London in the 1870s. So when she gets down to London, she meets this bloke, John McCormack. He also was known by the name of Brian. And it said he saw this poor homeless woman and thought, well, she seems like a hard worker, so they formed a relationship and lived together. It's not to say that they were smashing it out financially. They were living in doss houses a lot of the time. So these rooms you'd pay for nightly. And Alice said that she had some work. The police, by their records, said, well, that's not true. She was actually walking the streets to make money. She was known to smoke and drink, but they say that she was more known as a smoker rather than a heavy drinker. In fact, she had the nickname Clay Pipe Alice. But what happened on the 16th of July leading into the 17th of July in 1889 in Whitechapel to Alice? Well, it said that John came home from work at 4 p.m. and he'd had a couple. He'd had a drink or two at the pub, and so he hands her some money and says, go pay the rent, and here's a little bit extra as well. And then he's camping out. He's just laid out on the bed. So Alice takes the money, but as we'll see, the landlady says she never saw the rent at all. So did Alice just go take the money and start hitting the pubs herself? Well, actually, no. It said that at 7:10, and this was in a newspaper report, that Alice had taken this blind lad to the Cambridge Music Hall. Now, whilst there, this young lad heard her have a conversation with a bloke, and it basically went along the lines of, hey, do you want to go buy me a drink? And the bloke said, why not? Yes. So did that mean Alice then left this poor bloke, or rather this young lad, at the music hall and he can't find his way home? Well, no. She takes this young lad back home as well, and that's totally fascinating. So I'd suggest at this point she is not drunk. She's actually doing a really nice, good thing. And even though she's made arrangements to meet up with this guy and go have a drink, she still fulfills the responsibility to this young lad by making sure he gets home safe. But Elizabeth Ryder, the landlord at 8:30, says she saw Alice, and she was a bit worse for wear as regards the alcohol. So if she arrived at the music hall at 7:10 and took the young lad home after whatever function was on there, I would suggest it would be hard for her to get drunk, but that was the impression that the landlady gave, and also made a note that there was no rent money paid. So Elizabeth says that she saw John and Alice having an argument around this 8:30 p.m. And John previous has said that the last he saw of Alice was at 4 p.m. when he handed her the money. Now, someone's recollection is wrong here. It's either John's or it's the landlady, but those stories just don't match up. But it was at 11 p.m. that John actually leaves his room properly, apparently, and runs into the landlady, and she confirms again no rent had been paid. But it was 11:40 that Alice was seen around the Flower and Dean Street areas near Brick Lane by 3 other people, and they basically make inquiries of her saying, look, how are you going? She says, look, I'm fine, but I've got somewhere to be, so I can't stop and have a chat. So at 12:15 of July 17th, 1889, so we've moved into the early hours of the morning now, P.C. Allen takes a break underneath one of the street lamps in Castle Alley. And this Castle Alley, it said, is just off the Whitechapel High Street. Now, the lighting here is important, but he's saying down this alley, he really couldn't see anything. But he's just hanging there for a minute, having a bit of a munch, apparently. Then he sees another policeman appear in the alley. He's not needed there now, so he moves on, apparently. So now we got P.C. Andrews in that alley at 12:20 a.m. and it said that he stays there for about 3 minutes and sees nothing in this alley at all. But stated at 12:25, the person running this wash house, bath house, she retires to go to sleep at 12:25 a.m. and she heard nothing at all until the commotion begins. But what is of note here, and this is important, it is at 12:45, it stated it began to rain. Now that little piece of information is important to this. So P.C. Andrews returns to Castle Alley at 12:50. And he finds this body on the street. He moves the body and sees that the ground underneath is dry. Therefore, this attack must have occurred between 12:25 and 12:45. The person from the bathhouse didn't hear a thing. Just as a side note, one of the possessions found on her body was the clay pipe that she was very well known for. So it was soon worked out that this was the body of Alice McKenzie. Now, P.C. Andrews hears someone in the alley and says, hey, you got to stay here until I go and get more people. So P.C. Andrews has raised the alarm. Inspector Reed turns up at just before 1:10 and he noted that there was still blood coming from the wounds. But when Dr. Phillips arrives only about 4 or 5 minutes later, the blood had started to clot. Now, I don't know if it was still chucking down rain or not at this point, and whether that would have sort of impacted on any of this investigation. But once again, like previous ones, the medical information was very contradictory. See, Dr. Phillips said this looked very much like the Jack the Ripper crimes, yet there were some differences. Just the depth of the cuts and some of the way the crime occurred. So in his official statement, he said, I don't see it directly linked to Jack the Ripper. Yet Dr. Bond, who disagreed with Dr. Phillips in a previous one, also disagreed with him on this one, except this time he said it definitely was Jack the Ripper who committed this crime. Because it's exactly the same as what the last ones were. This is the same crime. Dr. Anderson, who last time agreed with Dr. Bond, this time totally disagreed with him and said it is not like Jack the Ripper at all, even though he didn't see the body until way later. He certainly didn't see it on that night. But another person who was actually on duty, another doctor, said no, this is definitely a Jack the Ripper crime because it matches it perfectly. So we got the first doctor on the scene who examined it, who believed a previous case definitely was, but said this time I don't see it. Other doctors definitely saying it was, and others saying it definitely wasn't. So this got very, very messy. Now, naturally, they did conclude that this was murder by person or persons unknown, and they ramped up policing. They had more police on the street because there was the concern. We've now seen the return of Jack the Ripper. So despite the official line from Sir Melville McNaughton that this is no longer a concern, the police department themselves were taking a very different view. But regardless whether it was Jack the Ripper or not, this atrocious crime was committed against poor Alice McKenzie. Now, oddly, just as a side note, some bloke by the name of Brodie confessed to committing this crime and also to all the other Whitechapel crimes. So they investigate him thoroughly and find out that he was nowhere near Whitechapel when any of these crimes happened. So they let him go, but as soon as they let him go, they rearrest him for fraud and other charges because he'd run his mouth in a bit of a drunken state and tried to make a claim that he'd done all these crimes. Well, because they looked into him so hard, they found out he had committed some crimes, but just not these ones. So let that be a lesson, kids. Always have a wingman if you're getting on the drink to make sure you don't say anything stupid. Because we've seen that a bit in this series so far. But sadly, none of Alice's family turned up to the funeral because no one actually knew where they were. The probably saddest part about this, it was John McCormack who gave us most of the details about Alice's life. And so again, we don't know, but I will just state this. He left his lodging at 11 p.m. Apparently they'd had an argument around 8 p.m. Just something to think about. Just putting that out there. But we still have 2 more victims to go. So what was the next situation? So now it was September the 10th of 1889 where a female torso missing its head and legs was found underneath a railway arch in Pinchin Street. Now, instantly, 3 people were arrested for this crime because they were sleeping rough near the area. And it seemed odd because apparently the smell was what attracted people to find this torso in the first place. But those 3 people were soon eliminated from having committed this crime. Sergeant Thick makes an appearance here as he, along with a couple more policemen, start investigating it. They do find some bloodstained clothing in the area, but they don't make any links to this murder at all. But what is of interest, some newspaper person, now we can't fully trust what the newspapers will say because they said things to sell a few papers, as we know, but they had reported there had been a murder in Backchurch Lane, which ran alongside Pinchin Street, or near there, I should say. So it suggested that this was the crime that occurred and the body had been moved. This was reported in other papers, not so much locally, but more internationally, this particular story. But why you would go to a newspaper person and not to the police, I don't know. So I don't know the full veracity of that particular statement. Now, in the investigation, they say, look, the person was fairly healthy. Their hands didn't show signs of any hard work, though the police say she most likely was a factory worker. How they draw that conclusion, I don't know. Now, it is important to note that no other body parts were ever found. They never found the head or the legs. But the suggestion was made in some media reports that this could have been Lydia Hart, who was an unfortunate walking the streets, and she'd gone missing around this time. But that was never confirmed. But then Lydia Hart was never seen again either. They stated the death happened on September the 8th, 1889, which is the anniversary date of Annie Chapman, an official Ripper victim, when her murder occurred. And so the similarity to that date wasn't lost on some people. And so the idea that perhaps this was Jack the Ripper now performing crimes on the same night as previous ones. And yet this is soon shut down. And so Melvick McNaughton comes out and says, definitely not a Jack the Ripper crime, because he knows that those crimes are over. But he does link it to the other Thames Torso murders. And yet, we still have one more potential victim to go. So the last one that we are looking at happened a long time after the Pinchin Street mystery as well. We're talking 1891, so nothing officially happened in 1890 as regards Jack the Ripper victims. Now, I want to state that this is not saying that no bad things happened during that time, because they did, but the media and the police did not make any connection to Jack the Ripper crimes until this event happened, and it was to Frances Coles. Now, she was born in 1859 in September. Now, her family were not wealthy, but they seemed to make do. She was in gainful employment for a fair chunk of her life, and it would be safe to say she was a proud person as well, because she fell on difficult times and then ended up working the streets and living in the doss houses. Yet, and this is important to note, she hid that fact from her family. Like, she would tell them that she was doing either service work or working in some of these factories, but she would not tell them the actual circumstance of her life. Even in 1891, she was going to church with her father, but it was said that she was taking her father to church every Sunday. And he was quite advanced in age in 1891, and he knew nothing about the life that she was living. Now, we've covered James Sadler in this series, so if you want to check that out, you can. We won't talk too much about him here. But it was on the night of February 12th going into February 13th of 1891 that these events happened. But it was said on this particular night that James and Frances were doing what in Australia we would call the pub crawl, going from one place to the next. Now, somewhere along the way, she buys a new hat. Now, the person that sold that hat said that she was 3 sheets in the wind. I'm guessing that's an English term for either being quite loud or perhaps a little bit tipsy, which would be understandable if you had been doing a pub crawl. Coles and Sadler had an argument somewhere after her buying this hat, and they have gone their separate ways. But Sadler and Coles often stayed at Spitalfields Chamber, which was a doss house. Now, Frances has gone back there and she's passed out drunk at one of the tables. James gets back there after being beaten up and mugged. They ship him off, but they can't seem to get rid of Frances. But she wakes up not long after and also goes back out onto the street because she didn't have the money for the room for the night. But at 1:45 a.m, a very strange event happens. Frances has run into another unfortunate, and this woman describes the bloke that approached both of them as fierce looking with the cheese cutter hat. Now, he propositions her. So Frances's companion, he hits her up. She refuses because she didn't like the look of him. And he punches her. Just straight to the face. But for whatever reason, Frances does not decline the invitation, and off she goes. Now, I would suggest that alcohol played a part in lack of good judgment there for Frances. But it was between 2 and 12 past 2 in the morning that 3 blokes are walking through Swallow's Garden, which was a railway arch, and they see a man and a woman, and the woman had this hat, and they call out, but they don't get a response. But they don't worry about it, and they keep on going. But then it was 2:15, At 2:15, that PC Thompson comes across Swallow Gardens and he hears a bloke running away. And then he gets his light because it's dark and he sees the body of Frances Coles. And depending on the reports, it said that she was still alive and he had to stand there and watch her take her last breath. Because the protocol at the time was if they came across a body, they were not allowed to leave until someone else came along. And he said that haunted him for the rest of his life, because he could have perhaps been pursuing Jack the Ripper. And sadly for this policeman, it was only 10 years later that he himself was attending a big brawl and he got stabbed to death, which is tragic as well. But quite a few police turn up, so only 10 minutes later we've got a couple of policemen, one plainclothes. Chief Inspector Swanson, the lead investigator of Jack the Ripper's there, and later on so is Sir Melville McNaughton. This crime was done and there was no mutilation like the Ripper crimes, but the papers and the police were thinking about it. They really investigated James Sadler and they actually charged him with this murder. But the difference between the Ripper crimes and this one was that a blunt knife was used. And oddly, James Sadler sold a blunt knife not long after this event, and they do arrest him. But they actually believed that the knife that he sold wouldn't even been able to inflict these wounds on Frances Coles. But the charges against him weren't dropped because they didn't think that he committed this crime, but rather because they just had insufficient evidence. And there is evidence to suggest that he was elsewhere at 2 a.m., so perhaps justice was done in that case, but he was the only real suspect of the Frances Coles crime. The press hadn't had a good Ripper story for a while, and so they said, look, this could be return of Jack the Ripper. The police soon shut it down, and surprisingly, this story disappeared very quickly. So going back to 1887 with Fairy Fay, a most likely fictional person but linked to Jack the Ripper crimes, all the way up to Frances Coles in 1891. We see a marked difference in the attitudes of everybody towards these crimes. Early in 1888, 4 to 5 women had been assaulted or murdered. And it only really ramped up in press and public perception when Martha Tabram was murdered. And now she's not considered an official Ripper victim, but when the 5 happened and a crime being publicised in between, the attitudes of people on the street, they were terrified. There was a vigilance committee. People were out to catch this perpetrator. And so were the police. But for whatever reason, after the Mary Kelly crime happened, the police lost all interest. Now, the official word was, we've caught the Ripper. Yet they kept investigating them. Donald Swanson investigated James Sadler when he was arrested for murdering Frances Coles. So if the chief inspector of the Jack the Ripper crimes thought the Ripper had been caught, why did he waste his time? But the purpose of this series was to paint the picture of what life was like for these poor people who were getting attacked or murdered. They were real people, at least 16 of them were, maybe not Fairy Fay. But they had their failings, yes, but don't we all? But they had good hearts, and they certainly did not deserve the treatment meted out to them. So what do you think of this entire series? Let me know down in comments. Did you find it interesting? But just so you know what I'll be doing here on the pub test, yes, we will be continuing the Jack the Ripper Suspects series. There's still more of them to go. Also looking at delving into some other interesting stories as well. But I've also got a little project, and it is to do in the Jack the Ripper vein. Just something different that I'm going to try. And we'll see how that works. So keep an eye out for that when it gets out, probably in about a week's time. I'm just going to do a bit of a test to see how it might go. I really mean it when I say your viewing is truly appreciated, and thank you all for your comments and suggestions as well. I'm Owen, you've been watching the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one. And look out for it. It's going to be quite interesting.